This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg. Our podcast and YouTube channel, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. On YouTube, on YouTube, just put in the three words, Spirit Matters Talk. You can then not only listen to us, but see us. And we have about 300 shows in our archives. For those that have been contributing to help keep us on the air, we thank you. And for those that have not, go to our website and you'll see how you can do so. And also, if whether you're listening or watching, please hit the subscribe button. It is free, and we want to get as many subscriptions as possible. We have a wonderful guest today, Steve Taylor. He is a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University and the author of several best-selling books on psychology and spirituality. He is the current chair of the Transpersonal Psychology Section of the British Psychological Society. His 13 books include Awakening from Sleep, The Fall, Out of the Darkness, and his latest book, Extraordinary Awakenings. And we want to focus on that today, along with other areas that he has done research and has worked in. There's a copy of the book. Thank you so very much, Steve, for taking the time to come on today.
No worries. Great to be with you.
Steve, we always like to have our guests share with our audience something of their own spiritual history. In your case, it led you to, well, that's the question. Tell us a little bit about your early years and what led you to your spiritual interests and in transpersonal psychology. Which came first, psychology or your interest in spirituality?
Spirituality came first. I think it was always inside me. You know, at least from the age of 16 or 17, I became aware of an innate spirituality, although I didn't understand it at the time. At the time, I thought it was a bit crazy and that maybe there was something wrong with me because I felt so different to other people. I was very drawn to solitude and I found it difficult to be with other people. I was very drawn to nature, although I lived in a big city, so there wasn't much nature around. But I used to sort of find natural spaces such as parks or my school fields. I used to go back to my school fields in the evenings just to walk around and enjoy the solitude and the quietness. And sometimes I'd feel a sense of connection to my surroundings and a sense of well-being, a sense of oneness with the natural phenomena around me, a feeling of harmony and connection. But as I say, at the time, I didn't understand those experiences. I thought they offered further evidence that I was a bit crazy. But I only really began to understand the experiences when I was probably 22 years old. I discovered books about mysticism and spirituality, and I began to recognize my own experiences, and I began to build up a framework to make sense of my experiences. And after that, I began to explore spirituality, and that led me to transpersonal psychology later on.
If I could ask, you use the term post-traumatic growth, and obviously, this is the area that the book focuses on. Tell us about that, because I think most people are not, although they would be familiar with what that term expresses, I think they're not familiar with the term, and if you could define it for us.
Yeah, as you say, I think most people have experienced it, even if they don't know it. But the term post-traumatic growth refers to the long-term positive after effects of traumatic experiences. So research in psychology over a period of maybe 30 years now has shown that, even if they take years to manifest themselves, a lot of people, probably up to around 50% of people who go through traumatic events will eventually experience positive effects, such as an enhanced sense of appreciation and gratitude, more intimate relationships, more interest in spirituality or in philosophical issues. So post-traumatic growth is quite common. But in my book, Extraordinary Awakenings, I focus on a more dramatic kind of post-traumatic growth, which I call transformation through turmoil. And that's when post-traumatic growth occurs in a very sudden and dramatic way, when people undergo a kind of identity shift in the midst of intense trauma and turmoil, almost as if they become a different person living in the same body.
I don't know how it is in the UK, but here in the US, there's been a lot of focus and interest on post-traumatic stress disorder and the lingering effects of trauma. Sometimes, just sort of dysfunctional family kind of trauma, sometimes, the wars and catastrophe kind of trauma. But we're led to believe that this is something that stays with people in a negative way throughout their lives. Although we occasionally hear from people who go through a severe illness or a loss or catastrophe and who say, oh, it turned out to be a blessing in disguise because I learned this and I grew in this way. You make it sound like the post-traumatic growth and transformation through turmoil is more common than we realize it is. Is that so?
Yeah, definitely. I think it is very common. I mean, research shows that 47% of people will undergo some form of post-traumatic growth, and even transformation through turmoil, which is more radical and more rare. Even that is not uncommon. I estimate that something like 1 in 100 people will go through intense turmoil and suffering and undergo transformation. And it is a spiritual awakening, and it's very common in the annals of spiritual history.
Yeah.
So many spiritual teachers have been through experiences of incredible turmoil before they underwent their awakening. Sri Aurobindo, the great Indian evolutionary spiritual philosopher, he underwent his transformation when he was in prison, when he was in his 20s, I think. Eckhart Tolle is probably the most well-known example. But, in the midst of ordinary life, I believe there are thousands of people walking amongst us who have undergone this transformation, but they don't necessarily interpret it in spiritual terms. They know that they feel different and their lives run much more smoothly and they're much more effective and they feel much more connected, much more fulfilled in their lives. But they wouldn't necessarily call it a spiritual awakening. And a lot of people never talk about it because they're afraid that their friends will think they're crazy, which, sometimes that is the case.
Or that they're in denial.
They may be in denial. That's possible too. Yeah.
No, I mean that people would think they're in denial if they say, they've grown because of their experience and they've changed.
Oh yeah.
Let me ask Steve, in your book, you share the stories of people you refer to, I think, as shifters who have had dramatic transformations. How did you locate, find, identify those people?
Some of them came to me because I've been writing about similar issues over the years. About 4 years ago, I published a book called The Leap, with the subtitle "The Psychology of Spiritual Awakening." I talked about lots of different kinds of spiritual awakening in that book, but a lot of people would write to me and say, "Hey, I've undergone a spiritual awakening, and it happened after I was diagnosed with cancer, or it happened, after I've been addicted to alcohol or drugs for a long time, or when I attempted suicide." So a lot of people just wrote to me, and then other people told me about remarkable cases. So it kind of snowballed. I mean, I had many more. I think in the book, I discuss about 30 different people, but, I could have extended the book, but, to 4 times that length because so many people got in contact with me.
Is there something about the people who become shifters, who you identify as having these big breakthroughs after very difficult life experiences? Is there something about them that's different, that's identifiably different from people who undergo similar trauma but don't shift?
Yeah, that's a good question, because everybody goes through trauma at some point in their lives, at several points in our lives. We all experience bereavement many times in our lives. A lot of us go through depression or addiction and so forth. Some of us go to prison, but not so many prisoners undergo transformation and so forth. But, as I said before, maybe only 1 in 100 people experience this transformation. So that was one of the questions I thought a lot about. What is it that makes these people different? But it is quite a mysterious transformation that's difficult to explain in some ways. But one feature of it is that it's a lot to do with ego dissolution, breaking down of the ego. When people go through intense turmoil and suffering, it just, it destroys their identity. Or it could be like an intense period of stress, which is like an earthquake. It suddenly sort of shatters your identity. But, when most people have that kind of breakdown, it is just a painful experience. It just brings them even more suffering. But for a small number of people, that breakdown is a shift up. It is an awakening. And that, it seems to be because there is a kind of latent higher self inside them, which is ready to be born, which is waiting to be born. Somehow that there is an alternative higher self, which is fully formed as a structure, just like a chick, which is ready to hatch out of the egg. It's just waiting for the opportunity. So that's what happens in some people, that they're just ready for it to emerge.
So is it, I mean, if we agree that we all have that latent higher self, as you put it, what makes some people ready for it? And is it just a question of personal growth and development and past experience and what we call karma?
Possibly. I mean, some people just don't seem to be ready. But I mean, there are other factors too, like the attitude with which you respond to your predicament is very important. For example, I found that people who had the kind of courage and openness to face their predicament with an attitude of acceptance, or, well, first of all, to acknowledge their predicament, to acknowledge the full reality of their predicament, no matter how painful and, dangerous it was. That was very important. But I think the most important thing was acceptance. A lot of people could identify one particular moment when they accepted their situation. And that was when the transformation occurred.
Right. Steve, if you were asked to speak to, or maybe you've done this, a group of, say, prisoners, people that are in for crime, that their lives have been seriously disrupted by it. And the recidivism rate is quite high, at least in the States, I'm sure in England as well. A lot of people come back. If you were to speak to a group like that, and they were there because they were interested in what you were talking about, what would you advise them? Because in your book, you talk about a 4-step process of responding to suffering and turmoil. So they're in a situation, suffering, turmoil, disruption, and they're either going to go back to that, or they're going to transcend or go beyond that. Is there specific advice that you would give them?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, prison is actually paradoxically quite a fertile environment for spiritual growth.
Right.
And that's because when you're in prison, first of all, you have the opportunity for self-exploration, which we often don't have when we're living in the external world, when our lives are so busy and so full of activity. And also in prison, you're forced to let go of everything which constitutes your identity. All of your roles, all of your attachments are outside the prison walls on the other side. Right. So in prison, I mean, that's partly why it's such a painful experience, because you have to let go of everything which gives you identity. But that is also, a very fertile ground for spiritual growth. So really, you need to sort of harness the potential of the situation, I would say. First of all, you've got to acknowledge the reality of your predicament. You've got to stop resisting the reality of your predicament, even if you're in prison. I mean, this is obviously incredibly difficult to do. If you have a long-term prison sentence, it's very painful to face the reality of your predicament, but you have to face up to it. That you're going to spend X number of years in prison, and this is your environment. This is your living environment for the indefinite future. And once you've acknowledged the predicament, then you have to let go of resistance and accept. Somehow let go. Just stop trying to hang on to your previous identity. And also, prison is a very turbulent environment. It can be very noisy, and it's full of agitation and violence. So you need to go, if you want to find peace, you have to go within. You have to sort of explore yourself and go within to find inner peace. So I think, some prisoners are forced to do that. They realize that the only possibility of finding peace is to go within. And prison forces them to do that. So a lot of prisoners do start to meditate. And once they do start to, engage with that inner process of development, that's when their transformation begins.
Would you apply that same reasoning to other forms of severe trauma? Prison is one thing, it's an extended time. but you also talk about things like being at war or in combat, I should say, and probably natural disasters, illness, sudden death of loved ones, things like that. How does that process work in those instances, especially around what you mentioned earlier, the loss of ego identity?
It's very similar. You could take bereavement as an example. Bereavement is probably the most common and most painful human experience. It's like an earthquake which disrupts everything in our lives. You know, it destroys all of the familiarity and stability around us. And once the ground settles again, the world seems like a completely different place. You know, and it kind of breaks down our identity because, you know, the world has changed so much. But, you know, that is a very painful experience, but also it does offer a great deal of transformational potential if you approach it in the right way. Some people naturally find bereavement very difficult to accept, and, you know, they divert themselves from the reality of it. You know, they maybe drink or take drugs to try to get away from the pain, which is, again, completely understandable. But you have to, you know, acknowledge and accept the reality that that you have lost that person, that you are never going to encounter them directly in this form, in this world, and your life is going to be completely different from now on. And if you engage with that process of acceptance, and if you open yourself and surrender and let go, that's usually when transformation begins to take place.
Do you
Same, you know,
provide
Sorry.
or recommend tools for helping that transformation to take place? For instance, meditation, yoga, any spiritual practices that you feel are particularly helpful for somebody? Because it's one thing for somebody to make an intellectual decision. Hey, this is right. I've been an alcoholic. I've been in trouble. I'm going to get beyond this. I'm going to make this work for me. I'm inspired by the lives of these shifters that have done it. Why can't I do it? What tools? Give me anything. I give you everything that will help me make this leap. And so what sorts of things do you recommend to them? Lifestyle changes.
Well, therapy can be very helpful. You know, things like acceptance and commitment therapy is a very useful therapeutic intervention, because therapy can help you to go through that process of acknowledgement and acceptance. It can give you like a safe and supportive framework to go through that process. Meditation is very important. I found that a lot of shifters underwent their transformation following a period of meditation. There was actually a prisoner I interviewed he's been in prison now for 40 years in Arkansas. And, you know, about 8 years into his prison sentence, it was a bit like I described earlier. He realized that he had to go within. If he was going to find any happiness in this kind of turbulent environment, he had to go inside. He didn't know what meditation was, but in retrospect, he realized that he was spontaneously meditating and just sort of focusing on his own inner being. And there was a certain point where something broke down inside him, and he began to cry for the first time that he could remember. He began to empathize with the people he'd hurt due to his crime, and he empathized with himself. So meditation somehow broke down the inner boundaries which separated him from his spiritual self. And also there are lots of meditative processes or activities, such as contact with nature, periods of quietness and inactivity. Solitude can be very helpful. So there are lots of different strategies and practices we can go through to facilitate the transformational process.
Did you find that people who underwent these kind of shifts spontaneously, the ones who you call shifters, to what extent did it lead to a different way of life subsequently? And were some did they tend to be people who had a spiritual life prior to, or didn't and then did? How did it change their way of life?
In most cases, it was people who didn't really know anything about spirituality. They'd never engaged in spiritual practices before. And that was why some people found it difficult to understand what had happened. In a few cases, people did have a spiritual background, but even then, they sometimes found the transformation difficult to adjust to because it was so radical. And certainly having a spiritual background made it easier for them to make sense of what had happened. And what normally happened was that, you know, if people didn't know anything about spirituality, they felt fantastic. They felt this new sense of connection and this new sense of fundamental well-being. But it was sometimes overlaid with confusion. But usually over a period of months or years, they gravitated towards spiritual traditions. Usually they read a book by chance and thought, this is what's happened to me. Now I understand. So that was very helpful. And and in terms of the changes, it did bring about very radical changes. A lot of people changed careers. For example, one woman was, she was the IT manager at a pharmaceutical company. Then she was diagnosed with cancer and underwent a transformational journey. And she couldn't do the job anymore. It just didn't seem right. So she became a therapist and a counselor.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it has bad effects. So sometimes it breaks down relationships. Sometimes it leads to divorce, because for the partners of these people, it's as if they're suddenly married to a different person. They're like, who is this person? This is not the person I married 20 years ago. So yeah, that's the unfortunate, you know, it can lead to breakups in relationship.
Right. Steve, you mentioned a gentleman in that you worked with in Arkansas, and you're based in the UK. Have you noticed that there are cultural differences? There are some cultures that lend themselves more to this type of transformation than others, or certain religious groups or types of people categorically that are more or less apt to make these changes.
I think in cultures which are more accepting of spirituality, such as perhaps Indian culture or Buddhist cultures, such as Thailand or Sri Lanka, they would be more likely to, you know, provide a framework which would enable people to make sense of this experience. You know, in secular cultures such as, you know, Europe and the US are largely secular cultures now. You know, any unusual states of consciousness are thought of as insanity, so that they are pathologized. So people, you know, usually people have usually shifters have a deep knowing that they have not gone crazy, but other people around them may say, you know, have you been taking drugs, or, you know, have you had a breakdown? And the psychiatrist will give them medication, sometimes even section. So yeah, certainly in other cultures, there would be a better outcome for these experiences. But one thing I've found actually is that women seem to be more likely to undergo this experience.
Interesting.
I don't have any hard statistics, but I've probably been contacted by over 200 people who've had this experience, and probably 2/3 of them are women. So there may be, it could be that women are just more willing to come forward about their experiences, or maybe there is something about, you know, something fundamentally slightly different about women that makes them more open to these kind of experiences.
Or since there's a certain amount of surrender and ego abandonment, that maybe men are more invested in toughing it out or something. And
maybe the sort of socially conditioned male ego is a bit more rigid and solid, and therefore not as open to these kind of experiences.
Well, Steve, your book seems to be practically oriented. We've been talking about the focus of your book being people who've undergone these severe traumas, but you make what you've learned from it accessible to everybody. I mean, we all have traumas, but the severe traumas, you know, imprisonment, warfare, things like that are rare. What about the average person, especially our listeners who tend to be spiritually inclined people? How would you apply the lessons you've learned to our lives? And you have, I'll give you the intro, your 4-step process in the book.
Yeah, people sometimes say to me, you know, are you saying that we have to suffer in order to grow spiritually? But no, that's not the case at all. I mean, obviously there are lots of different ways of undergoing spiritual development. I think most people who are engaged in spiritual awakening or development, you know, they haven't necessarily been through intense trauma. They've just engaged with spiritual paths and practices because of some deep inner impulse inside them. I think sometimes trauma and turmoil can shift that process along, and maybe even shift us up to a higher level of development. But, you know, we can certainly apply some of the principles the people in my book have undergone to our own spiritual development. And one of them is what I call psychological detachment. I don't mean detachment in a negative sense, in the sense of being indifferent to the world. I mean not being psychologically attached to too many external things. So I believe that most people go through transformation in sort of turbulent situations because they have to let go of their psychological attachments. They have to let go of their ambitions for the future. They have to let go of their social roles. They have to let go of beliefs, let go of relationships, and so on. So everything which constitutes their identity is taken away, all of their attachments. And when enough attachments are taken away, the ego itself collapses. So attachments are like the building blocks of the ego. So we can certainly, follow that principle in our own lives. We can, try to be consciously aware of the things we are attached to and try to dissolve some of the attachments and try to focus our well-being within, rather than depending on external attachments for well-being. We can turn within and find the true source of well-being. So that's one thing. Also, I found that a lot of people in my book experience transformation through encounters with death, simply through becoming aware of the reality of death. So I recommend that, we should make friends with death. We should contemplate our own mortality. We should visit cemeteries and just, at the same, I love to visit cemeteries, not just because they're incredibly peaceful and beautiful surroundings, but because I like to remind myself of the gift of life and how fragile and temporary the gift of life is. So there are things like that.
Phil, any final questions?
I'm curious. I do have a couple of other points. I know a certain spiritual tradition, especially in the East. What you just said is often baked in. It's, people. I did a biography of Yogananda. He had a tantric teacher when he was young who would take him to the graveyard and who brought a skull into his meditation room. So they would be aware of death. And I'm also curious, in a lot of the, especially monastic settings in the East, this process of breaking down people's ego attachments is often a very deliberate strategy used by gurus, sometimes to such excess that people become traumatized and it's inappropriate. But that kind of strategy, both gentle and by administering certain shocks and putting people through certain things, seems very similar to the spontaneous things that happen with turmoil. Have you looked into any of that? Those teachings?
Yeah, I think every spiritual tradition emphasizes the importance of detachment. You were just saying about Yogananda, and in Buddhism they have cemetery meditations where, and also if a Buddhist monk sees a dead body by the side of the road, by the side of the path, as they would do perhaps 2,000 years ago, they would sit down and meditate just to contemplate the fragility and impermanence of their own lives. And that kind of strategy, being aware of death, is also a way of breaking down your ego attachments. I think it's probably the most effective way of breaking them down. And a lot of Christianity mystical Christianity emphasizes the same thing. Giving up your worldly goals and possessions. The monastic tradition is about that. It's about in the book I suggest there are lots of parallels between monks and prisoners. Even they both live in cells. But it's the same kind of thing. You're living a life of conscious detachment. A monk is living a life of conscious detachment.
It also seems that when Phil mentioned about the religious orders being with a guru, being in a monastery, I have some familiarity with like a Trappist monastery, Thomas Merton, that tradition, and they often talk about the dark night of the soul. So they're in this, they're deep in prayer, meditation, deep, just turning in. It's a very solitary life, although they're living in a group, but there's a lot of quietness. And they all seem to reach a point where, and I think it's described as letting go of the attachments, where they have this dark night, this before the light comes. And it seems to be a common tradition, and not only in Christian monasticism, but in all the traditions, they talk about that. And it seems to be right along the lines of what you're discussing in your book. The chaos, the trauma that comes before the growth.
Yeah. The only difference is that in my book, it happens accidentally and spontaneously. But yeah, it's the same thing. It's a kind of, I mean, in AA, they use the term bottoming out.
Right.
It's like, you become completely empty. You lose everything.
Right.
But in some way, that connects you with something deeper within yourself.
Steve, one quick question about one of the stages and strategies you talk about being important, which is acceptance. Could you elaborate a bit about acceptance? Because often when you say to people to, accept your situation, it sounds like one is advocating being passive and not doing anything to change the situation or the circumstance. And that it seems counterproductive in that sense. What do you mean by acceptance, and how does it differ from what I said?
That is a common misinterpretation. Acceptance does not necessarily mean becoming passive and indifferent. It doesn't mean that you have to accept negative aspects of your life, because obviously there are some aspects of your life that may need to be changed. If you are in an abusive relationship, if you're living in a terrible environment, maybe you need to change those things rather than just accept them. But often, acceptance is the beginning of the process of change. Before you change things, you need to accept them. You need to open, maybe acceptance is a slightly misleading term. You should maybe talk about letting go of resistance. Once you let go of resistance to your predicament, then you open yourself to it. You become fully aware of the reality of it. And then you can actually discern what needs to be changed. Then you have a greater discernment. I always love the AA prayer, the one about give me the grace to accept what cannot be changed and the wisdom to change what ought to be changed, something along those lines.
Right.
But yeah, there are some things
I know it, but I couldn't.
You know the one.
Yes. The wisdom to know. Oh God, now I can't remember it either. But it's the wisdom to know the difference between what you can change and what you can't change.
Right.
Yeah.
To accept the latter.
Anyway,
so the important thing is just to let go of resistance and open yourself to the reality of your predicament, and then you can undergo liberation, and you also gain the strength and the discernment to change what needs to be changed.
Steve, any final words you'd like to share with our listeners? And then Phil,
I'll hold up the book again.
A little bit clear, a little bit more to the center.
Our friends at New World.
Back it up a little bit. There you go. Extraordinary Awakening.
Extraordinary Awakenings when trauma leads to transformation.
Perhaps the only thing I'd like to end with is that, I think we human beings, we often underestimate ourselves. And when life is running smoothly and easily, we tend only to scratch the surface of our potential. But when we're challenged by crises and by trauma, we have to go deep within ourselves. And almost always we find massive reserves of resilience, which we were never aware of. So I'd like to remind everybody that we are actually much stronger than we realize. We are deeper and stronger than we realize. And when we do go through traumatic events or critical situations, in almost all cases, we'll find the resilience to cope with them. And maybe we'll also find a lot of transformational potential too.
Very good.
Excellent. Thank you so very much.
Thanks so much for being with us, Steve.
Thank you.
And again, the book is Extraordinary Awakenings.
We'll have all that information posted up as well.
And continue your good work. We'll look forward to your next publication. And
oh, right. Brilliant. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Phil, that was Steve Taylor from the UK, Manchester. He is, aside from the book he wrote that we'll be discussing, and we discussed with him today, he's a very prolific writer. I mean, written dozens upon dozens of articles, and he also, I think this is his 13th book, Extraordinary Awakening. So, I just want to say one thing. When I was thinking about it, how out of turmoil comes maybe a higher consciousness, or a greater clarity of thinking. I was thinking back to my college days, and the period of time right before I learned to meditate, which that was like 50 years ago, and it was a time of great upheaval, confusion, reevaluating life, what was important, and I felt I was first excited and then confused, and then I think a little down on everything that was going on. And that's when, if I hadn't had that turmoil going on in myself, I don't think I would ever reach for something else.
Point, because I think your point suggests that what he discovered in his research could apply collectively, like to a generation like ours, and maybe to the young people today who are going through COVID and insurrections and all kinds of craziness, climate change. But we went through, we were dealing with Vietnam. People like you and me were, could get drafted. It was a tumultuous time. In my case, my mother died during that period. It was really crazy. And it sparked a real search. Some people descended into heavy drug use and self-destructive tendencies, and some of us set out to find, a different way of living and truth. And that's an interesting point.
But it's interesting. I just thought of something else. I was on a train one time in Sweden, and I started chatting with two guys, and they were both Latter-day Saints, Mormons, on mission. And I said, "How is it?" And they were great, very friendly, and we were talking mostly about sports. And then I got on the subject. I goes, "How is it doing mission work here?" Which I'm not so familiar with. I'm not Mormon, but I've read about it. I've talked to others, and they said it's very difficult here. And I said, "Why?" I said, people are pretty happy. They're not looking for anything. So I think that it's an interest. That's exactly what he said. He said, yeah, they're happy, they're content, but it's after some tragedy, some turmoil, that people think, wait a second, there's got to be more. We have to find something. And I think that, he brings that out in Extraordinary, in his book, and so Extraordinary Awakenings. And
but what's interesting? In all the interviews I've done over the years, and I've done hundreds of them, not just on our podcast, but for my book research, sometimes it's people who have the opposite of tragic lives. People who are, everything goes right, they're living the dream, they have success, they have money, they have a beautiful family, and good things have happened to them. Sometimes they are the ones who say, yeah, but I'm still not feeling fulfilled. I'm still not satisfied. There must be something else. There must be something more. So good fortune can lead some people to a spiritual search. But I think the observation that good can come from tragedy, and in Steve Taylor's case, he's backing it up with the kind of rigorous research that a psychologist would do. It's not just the observations of informal researchers like you and me.
Right, and it's interesting. He's very involved as an organization. I think he heads it up for transpersonal psychology in the UK. You mentioned it. It hasn't gotten full traction in the US, but really, transpersonal psychology is about putting together psychology and spirituality. And I think that if one had a spiritual inclination, and many of our listeners and viewers do, if you were looking for a therapist, you would certainly want to get somebody, I would think, who had at least that perspective or was open to that. And I was in graduate school in psychology, and believe me, at that time, most people weren't. That was considered very far out.
Oh,
And it was like, when I mentioned meditation, they just rolled their eyes. Not everyone. And and you could point out, hey, what about Carl Jung, and what about Maslow? There were people out there, but most of the people in mainstream psychology, this is early 70s, it was very foreign, and transpersonal psychology has come a long way, the acceptance from that, but it still has a long way to go.
but it started here. It started at Esalen and the Bay Area with people like Maslow and Stan Grof and some of those very early pioneers. And I write about them in American Veda. It was terribly important, and most of it centered around San Francisco and Esalen and that whole Bay Area. It was, the time of what they called the San Francisco Renaissance. And it got off the ground. It first became humanistic psychology, then evolved into transpersonal psychology. They had their own association, their own journal, all that. The association still exists, and some schools in the Bay Area still specialize in it. But somehow it got co-opted and absorbed into, the general field of psychology. So it doesn't even have its own subdivision in the American Psychological Association, whereas in the UK it does in their version of it. So it's interesting.
Whereas even non-transpersonal psychologists, people that would not associate that with that at all, they might recommend meditation or yoga to one of their.
That's right.
If
That's right. So maybe the mainstream
on the list of things that you have a good lifestyle, get exercise, meditate. So it's really. And again, you bring a lot of this out in American Veda, that Eastern knowledge, meditation, yoga, these things coming to the from the East to the West, and it's pretty new, and now it's quite mainstream. I mean, nobody rolls their eyes when you say meditation anymore.
No, I get mailings from Kaiser Permanente, my healthcare provider, telling me I should meditate for stress.
Someone may miss the boat by 50 years. I have a story about that. I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and this was, I don't know, a number of years ago, and I was having a lot of trouble, my eye blinking and eye watering, and it turned out it was dry eye or whatever. When I went to see the ophthalmologist, after he examined me, he said, have you ever thought of learning to meditate? I had already been about 20, 30 years into it. So I said, geez, is that but it turned out some drops did the trick.
I know. So anyway, at the risk of giving away our age.
The times they are changing. Maybe.
Oh, I'm sorry. I spoke over you because you froze for a second.
Oh. Your internet connection is, I'm getting a signal here, but I think you can hear me clearly. All right. Well,
now I can. Yeah.
Another outstanding interview, and we have some terrific ones coming up, folks. So
yeah, we do.
And again, there are a couple of things Phil and I very much would like to stay on the air. We want to keep this free and open to the public, and including our archives. We are not a nonprofit. You cannot donate and as you would to a nonprofit, but you can contribute to help us move forward and keep our archives open. And also, if you go to spiritmatterstalk.com, and it'll explain to you how you can contribute. And then we're thank the people who have done that already. And the other thing is, we would really like it if you would subscribe. So whether you're watching us on YouTube TV or are listening to us on the podcast, there's a little button you could just click. It doesn't cost anything. And please subscribe to us now. Our number of subscribers are going up and up, and we would like you to be part of that. So please, and any suggestions, email us. We've got a ton of stuff coming up, right, Phil?
Yeah, we do. We have some really interesting people lined up. We're recording this in early October. We have several lined up between now and Thanksgiving, and we're always open to
Suggestion.
new thinkers, teachers, scholars, authors. So if you have any suggestions for us, please let us know.
And we are both available. Phil does this regularly as speakers, either on a podcast or Zoom conference, however you want to do that. So there you go. So Phil, until next time.
Until next time, take care.